The call came early, too early for anything good. A body had been found near the edge of a motel parking lot in Villa Park, just outside Chicago. The officer on the other end didn't offer many details, only that it wasn't a sight for the faint-hearted. I arrived to find the air thick with the acrid stench of decay. Even before stepping out of the car, I knew this wouldn't be a routine case. The scene was already cordoned off, a few uniformed officers standing by with grim expressions. The field was overgrown, littered with beer cans and scraps of trash, the kind of place no one paid attention to until now. The body was found just beyond the parking lot, sprawled in the tall grass. She wasn't just dead. She had been mutilated in ways that turned even the most hardened stomachs. As I approached, the smell hit harder, but it wasn't just the odor that churned my gut, it was the state of her. The victim was a young woman, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back, a key snapped off in the lock. The damage to her body spoke of a methodical, almost ritualistic violence. Both her breasts had been severed, and her wounds suggested she had suffered for days before finally succumbing. This wasn't just a murder. It was something far darker. The medical examiner was already kneeling by the body when I crouched down to take a closer look. "Looks like she's been dead a few days," he said grimly, "but this level of decomposition, it's accelerated, probably from the open wounds. Insects exposure, it's bad." A small amount of cash was found stuffed into one of her socks. It felt like an afterthought, a mockery of the life stolen here. Later, we'd learn her name, Linda Sutton, a mother of 2 in her late 20s. But standing in that field, all we knew was that this was no isolated incident. It was the start of something far more sinister. The initial investigation painted a bleak picture. The brutality of the attack suggested a level of depravity we hadn't seen before. What kind of person or people could commit such an atrocity? As we combed through the scene, the question hung in the air, unanswered but suffocating. The motel staff, visibly shaken, recalled nothing unusual. No loud noises, no suspicious vehicles. Whoever had done this had slipped in and out like a phantom. The autopsy report came back within days, confirming our worst fears. Linda hadn't died immediately after the attack. She had been kept alive for almost a week, her body tortured and mutilated before she was discarded like trash. That knowledge sat heavy on all of us. She had suffered in ways no one should. What struck me most was the deliberate nature of the crime. The use of handcuffs, the precision of the mutilations, it all pointed to someone with a plan, someone who took their time. It wasn't impulsive. This was calculated, cold. Days turned into weeks, but the leads were few and far between. Then, another body surfaced, and another. Each one bore the same grotesque trademarks: handcuffs, mutilation, signs of prolonged torture. It was clear now that we weren't dealing with a lone predator. This was something more organized, something worse. The media caught wind of the case, dubbing the unknown assailants the Chicago Ripper Crew. The name spread like wildfire, sparking fear across the city. Women were warned to stay off the streets at night, to avoid getting into unfamiliar vehicles. But the warnings felt hollow when we had no answers, no suspects. The discovery of a survivor changed everything. Angel York, a young woman barely out of her teens, had lived through the nightmare and lived to tell us about it. Her body was a canvas of horrors, slashed, beaten, scarred, but she spoke through the pain, describing a group of men who had abducted her from the street, forced her to inflict harm upon herself, and then discarded her when they were done. Her story was our first glimpse into the depths of evil we were up against. She described a red van, a detail that would become crucial in the months to come. Her description of the men, cold, methodical, devoid of remorse, only deepened the shadows around the case. I kept replaying her account in my mind, the sheer terror in her voice. It wasn't just what they had done. It was how they had done it. With precision, with ritual, with a level of depravity that left no doubt this wouldn't stop until we found them. As more bodies emerged, the pattern grew clearer. These weren't random acts of violence. They were orchestrated. And the victims weren't just being killed, they were being desecrated. Someone, somewhere, had turned murder into a perverse performance, a macabre ritual that left us all questioning how far this could go. Standing in that field on that first day, staring down at Linda Sutton's lifeless body, I couldn't have imagined the horrors that would follow. But as each piece of the puzzle fell into place, one truth became clear. We were dealing with a kind of darkness that didn't just destroy lives, it devoured them. This was no longer a hunt for a killer. It was a race to stop a monster, or perhaps monsters. One thing was certain, the evil we were chasing was just beginning to reveal itself. Robin Gecht's name wasn't known to us in the beginning. The bodies, the brutality, and the fear, those were the constants. But the thread connecting everything led straight to him, a man whose ordinary facade is capable of unimaginable horrors. Gecht's story began like many others, a troubled childhood and a family life that left him grasping for control. Raised primarily by his grandparents after his parents' tumultuous relationship fell apart, he grew up isolated, angry, and fixated on things most children wouldn't dream of. Those who knew him described a boy with an unsettling demeanor, prone to fits of rage and dark obsessions. By his teenage years, Gecht had developed a fascination with the occult. He pored over texts on satanic rituals, committing the verses to memory. The rituals fascinated him not for their spiritual meaning, but for the power they promised. It wasn't long before he began experimenting, melding the symbols and practices into his own twisted fantasies. But none of this prepared us for what he would become. Gecht grew into a man who hid his darkness well. He married Rosemary, a devout Catholic, and together they had 3 children. To outsiders, they seemed like a normal family, living in a modest house on North McVicker Avenue in Chicago. He even started his own small business, RR Electric, earning a reputation as a hardworking, reliable electrician. But behind closed doors, Gecht's control over his family was absolute, and his home was the nexus of something far more sinister. In the attic of his home, Gecht created a space that would become the heart of his depravity. Decorated with satanic symbols and inverted crosses, it was a makeshift chapel, a place where rituals were performed and unspeakable acts carried out. The attic was his sanctuary, a hidden world that no one dared question. Gecht's influence wasn't limited to his home. Over time, he surrounded himself with others who were vulnerable, easily manipulated, and drawn to his magnetic but chilling personality. Among them were Edward Spritzer and the Kokoralaya's brothers, Andrew and Thomas. Spritzer, barely 19 when he met Gecht, had struggled his entire life. His upbringing was marred by abuse, neglect, and a constant sense of inadequacy. Gecht recognized those vulnerabilities immediately, offering Spritzer a place to stay and a job at RR Electric. It wasn't long before Spritzer became more than an employee, he became a follower. Andrew and Thomas Kokorales were another story. The brothers, known in their neighborhood for their limited intelligence and quiet demeanor, were easy prey for someone like Gecht. He pulled them into his orbit, promising camaraderie, a sense of belonging, and a shared purpose. It was this group, the so-called Chicago Ripper crew, that would bring Gecht's twisted fantasies to life. The crimes began as extensions of Gecht's desires. He sought control, not just over his followers but over life and death itself. The crew would drive through the streets of Chicago in a red Dodge van, searching for vulnerable women. When they found a target, the abductions were swift, precise. A cloth was shoved into the victim's mouth, and handcuffs snapped tightly around their wrists. From there, they were dragged into the van, where the true horror began. What happened to the women inside that van defied comprehension. Gecht's rituals revolved around mutilation, specifically targeting the breasts of his victims. He believed they held a special power, something he could harness through violence and ritual. The victims were tortured, violated, and mutilated in ways that left even the most seasoned investigators struggling to process the depravity. The crew's crimes weren't just acts of violence, they were performances. In the attic, with candles flickering and satanic verses echoing through the space, Gecht led his followers in rituals that involved the severed breasts of their victims. The body parts were desecrated in ways that defied humanity, reduced to symbols of Gecht's control and the crew's descent into darkness. The most chilling aspect of Gecht's power was the way he manipulated those around him. His followers spoke of him as if he were something more than human, claiming he possessed special abilities that allowed him to control their thoughts and actions. Whether it was fear, charisma, or something deeper, Gecht's hold on the group was unshakable. But Gecht didn't stop at manipulation. He pushed his followers to take part in the acts, forcing them to commit atrocities that bound them to him even further. By involving them in the murders, he ensured their silence and loyalty. It wasn't just about the rituals, it was about creating a web of complicity that no one could escape. Gecht's outward life remained intact during this time. He maintained his business, his home, and his image as a family man. Neighbors saw him mowing his lawn, fixing electrical issues, and doting on his children. They had no idea that the man who waved to them in the morning was the mastermind behind a string of the most heinous murders Chicago had ever seen. Looking back, the clues were their subtle signs that something was wrong. Neighbors recalled strange noises coming from the house late at night, the faint glow of candles in the attic windows. But no one could have imagined the true extent of what was happening behind those walls. Robin Gecht's influence was the key to everything. He didn't just kill, he orchestrated. He didn't just manipulate, he controlled. And as we dug deeper into his past, his connections, and his crimes, it became clear that the evil we were dealing with wasn't just in the actions of one man. It was in the way he made others believe they were part of something larger, something that justified the horrors they inflicted. This was no ordinary killer. This was a man who had turned murder into ritual, violence into religion, and fear into control. And we were only beginning to uncover the full extent of his reign. The victims of the Chicago Ripper crew were not just statistics, they were mothers, daughters, friends, and loved ones who deserved far better than the cruelty inflicted upon them. Each one had a story, a life cut tragically short by a darkness none of them could have foreseen. Their names, their lives, and their final moments are forever etched into the case that horrified a city and scarred a community. The first known victim, Linda Sutton, was a mother of 2 in her late 20s. She lived a challenging life, balancing the needs of her children while navigating personal struggles. Her disappearance didn't make headlines immediately. She was one of many who seemed to vanish into the void. But her body, discovered near a Villa Park motel in June 1981, would thrust her name into the spotlight. The brutality of her death, her mutilated body left to decompose in a field, shook even the most seasoned investigators. The suffering she endured lingered as a haunting reminder of the evil we were chasing. As weeks turned into months, more women vanished under similar circumstances. Each disappearance brought fresh waves of panic, and each grim discovery deepened the sense of dread. Lorraine Borowski, a 21-year-old receptionist, was one of them. On the morning of May 15, 1982, Lorraine was on her way to open the real estate office where she worked in Elmhurst. She never made it. Her keys and personal belongings were found scattered on the sidewalk near the office, a chilling testament to her abrupt and violent abduction. Her body wouldn't be discovered for 5 months, decomposed and discarded in a cemetery. Her wounds told the story of unimaginable torment. Shui Mak, a 30-year-old woman from a hard-working immigrant family, was another victim. On May 29, 1982, after a family dispute, she decided to walk home alone. She never arrived. Her remains were found months later, hidden in woods near a construction site. Like the others, she had been tortured and mutilated. Her life ended in a storm of violence. Then there were the survivors, women who endured the unthinkable and somehow lived to tell their stories. Angel York was only 19 years old when the crew abducted her. She was handcuffed, assaulted, and forced to mutilate herself. Gecht and his accomplices left her on the side of the road, bloodied and broken, assuming she wouldn't survive. But Angel did. Her harrowing account gave us our first real insight into the depravity of the crew. Beverly Washington, another survivor, faced similar horrors. She was abducted, mutilated, and left for dead near a railway line in October 1982. Against all odds, she survived and provided police with critical details, describing the van, her attackers, and the gruesome ordeal she endured. Her description of a thin, wiry man with unsettling eyes led us closer to identifying Gecht. Forensic examinations of the victims revealed chilling similarities. Each had been tortured in specific, ritualistic ways, their bodies mutilated with a focus on the removal of their breasts. This grotesque fixation became a signature of the crew, a macabre calling card that made it clear these weren't random killings. The victims had been chosen, and their suffering was intentional. The survivors' stories painted a picture of a group united not just by violence, but by a shared ritualistic belief system. The van, often described as red with darkened windows, was a mobile chamber of horrors. Inside, victims were stripped of their autonomy, their pain used as a tool for the crew's twisted desires. Gecht, the mastermind, ensured that each member participated, binding them to his vision of satanic ritual and absolute control. As the body count rose, so did the fear. Women in Chicago changed their routines, avoiding walking alone at night or entering unfamiliar vehicles. The media fanned the flames of terror, reporting on the satanic overtones and ritualistic nature of the murders. The city, already grappling with rising crime, now faced a new level of horror. The survivors became not just witnesses but symbols of resilience in the face of unspeakable cruelty. Their courage in recounting the events, despite the trauma, gave law enforcement the clues needed to piece together the scope of the crimes. Beverly Washington's testimony, in particular, led us to the red van, a critical breakthrough in the case. The victims of the Chicago Ripper crew shared more than just the circumstances of their deaths. They shared a humanity stolen from them in the most brutal way. Linda, Lorraine, Shuey, and others were not just names in a case file. They were women with hopes, families, and futures. The survivors, too, carried the weight of the crimes, their lives forever marked by the horrors they endured. Each body found, each story told, became a thread in the dark tapestry we were unraveling. The victims and survivors were more than evidence, they were the voices that demanded justice. The reminders of why we couldn't stop until we found those responsible. As the investigation continued, their stories became the heart of our pursuit, pushing us to uncover the full extent of the evil that had gripped Chicago. The investigation into the Chicago Ripper crew was one of the most grueling and frustrating cases I had ever worked on. The crimes were calculated, the killers meticulous, and the victims left behind in such a state that piecing together clues felt nearly impossible. Each discovery was a grim reminder of the evil we were hunting, but it wasn't until survivors like Angel, York, and Beverly Washington came forward that we began to see the threads connecting it all. Beverly Washington's account was a turning point. She described the van in chilling detail, a red Dodge with darkened windows, its interior stripped of handles to prevent escape. She also remembered small, unique details, a bundle of feathers hanging from the dashboard, the layout of the seats, all of which gave us a starting point. She recounted her attack with remarkable clarity, describing her assailant as slim, with unsettling eyes and a cold demeanor. When she mentioned the methodical way her breast was mutilated, we knew this wasn't an isolated incident. It fit the pattern. A description of the van went out citywide. Weeks passed without any leads, but we refused to let up. Finally, on October 20th, 1982, a patrol officer spotted a vehicle matching Beverly's description parked on a quiet street. The red Dodge stood out against the muted backdrop of the neighborhood. Inside, we found more confirming details, feathers tied to the rearview mirror, and modifications made to the interior that stripped away any means of escape. The driver, a man named Edward Spritzer, was brought in for questioning. Initially, he claimed ignorance, but his nervous demeanor betrayed him. The van's registration led us to Robin Gecht, a name that hadn't come up in our investigation until now. Gecht was a local electrician, running a modest business out of his home. To his neighbors, he was unremarkable, a family man with 3 children. But as we dug deeper, we found cracks in the facade. When we first questioned Gecht, he was calm, almost too calm. He denied any involvement and was released, but something about him didn't sit right. Meanwhile, Spritzer's resolve crumbled. Faced with mounting evidence, he confessed to a string of crimes, providing a chilling account of the Ripper crew's activities. His confession detailed their abductions, the rituals performed in Gecht's attic, and the unspeakable violence they inflicted on their victims. It was almost too grotesque to believe. Spritzer named the Kokoralais brothers, Andrew and Thomas, as additional members of the crew. We tracked them down quickly, arresting both within days. Andrew Kokoralais was the first to crack. His confession corroborated much of what Spritzer had told us, including the satanic rituals and the role Gecht played as the mastermind. Andrew even admitted to specific murders, providing details only the killers would know. A search of Gecht's home revealed further horrors. The attic, hidden away from the family below, was a shrine to Gecht's dark obsessions. Satanic symbols adorned the walls, and traces of blood were found in the ritual area. However, the most damning piece of evidence, the box of severed breasts described by Spritzer, was missing. Gecht, when confronted with this, continued to deny everything, his calm demeanor never wavering. Despite the overwhelming testimonies of his accomplices, tying Gecht directly to the murders proved difficult. He had orchestrated the crimes in such a way that his hands rarely touched the victims, instead manipulating his followers into carrying out the acts. It was a web of control that left us with circumstantial evidence but little physical proof linking him to the murders. The investigation uncovered a pattern of exploitation and manipulation. Gecht preyed on the weak and vulnerable, using their fears and insecurities to bind them to his will. His followers believed he had supernatural powers, that he could control their minds and actions. Whether it was fear, belief, or something else entirely, the grip he held over them was absolute. With the confessions of Spritzer and the Kokoralais brothers, we had enough to proceed with charges against the crew. The murders of Linda Sutton, Lorraine Borowski, and others were laid out in horrifying detail, each more chilling than the last. The rituals, the mutilations, the calculated violence, it was all there, a case unlike anything we had ever seen. Robin Gecht remained an enigma throughout it all. His lack of emotion, his refusal to admit guilt, and his calculated responses during questioning left us certain we were dealing with a man devoid of humanity. But without a confession or hard evidence linking him directly to the murders, we knew convicting him would be an uphill battle. As the case moved toward trial, the weight of what we had uncovered hung heavy over the city. The fear that gripped Chicago during the crew's reign of terror gave way to a collective demand for justice. For the victims, the survivors, and the families left behind, we owed it to them to see this through to the end. But as I prepared for the court proceedings, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to get, more to this story, than we had uncovered. The case was far from over. The trials of the Chicago Ripper crew were a long-awaited reckoning for the victims, their families, and the city of Chicago. Robin Gecht and his accomplices were brought before the court in a series of proceedings that laid bare the horrors they had inflicted. Each testimony, each piece of evidence, painted a picture of evil that defied comprehension. Edward Spritzer's detailed confession was a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. He described the crew's abductions, the mutilations, and the rituals conducted in Gecht's attic. Andrew and Thomas Cucurales also confessed, providing chilling accounts of their roles in the murders. Despite their damning statements, Gecht remained steadfast in his denial, showing no remorse and maintaining his innocence to the end. For the Cucurales brothers and Spritzer, justice came swiftly. Andrew Cucurales was sentenced to death and executed in 1999, becoming one of the last individuals put to death in Illinois before the state abolished capital punishment. Thomas Cucurales, initially sentenced to life, had his conviction reduced and was eventually paroled in 2019, a release that sparked outrage among the victims' families. Spritzer, though originally sentenced to death, had his sentence commuted to life in prison without parole, where he remains to this day. Robin Gecht, the mastermind, managed to escape murder convictions due to a lack of direct evidence linking him to the killings. Instead, he was convicted on charges of kidnapping, sexual assault, and attempted murder, receiving a sentence of 120 years. To this day, Gecht maintains his innocence, refusing to admit any involvement in the crime. He remains incarcerated, with the possibility of parole only in the distant future. The case left scars on Chicago that have never fully healed. The brutality of the crimes, combined with the satanic overtones, fueled a wave of fear and paranoia that lingered for years. For the families of the victims, the trials offered some closure, but the pain of their loss remains. The legacy of the Chicago Ripper crew serves as a grim reminder of the depths of human depravity. It also highlights the resilience of survivors like Beverly Washington, whose bravery in recounting her ordeal provided the crucial evidence needed to stop the crew's reign of terror. In the end, justice was served, but the shadows of their crimes will always loom over the city. The names of Linda Sutton, Lorraine Borowski, and the other victims will not be forgotten. Their lives, stolen so violently, continue to serve as a call to remember, to remain vigilant, and to ensure that such horrors are never allowed to happen again.